Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a strange journey tracing the lives of medieval people whose immune systems were so strong they could lick mud and still survive. From raw liver to rotting guts and fevers that nearly killed, they didn't just endure, they left us with a big question. Are we modern creatures wrapped in plastic and hand sanitizer really stronger than them? If you enjoy these kinds of dirty, deep, funny but sad history stories, hit that subscribe button, but only if it genuinely sparks your interest. And drop a comment to let me know what time is it where you are and where are you watching from. I'm always curious who's out there in the dark tuning in for these late-night history trips. Now dim the lights a bit. Let your body relax and let your imagination go wide open. We're about to begin in a world where being too clean might just be the most dangerous thing of all. Have you ever accidentally drunk water from a public restroom? No. Then you definitely did not live during the Middle Ages, because back then the cleanest thing you could possibly touch was the hand of a man who had just finished gutting a pig. Osric was different. This boy, just 7 years old, lived in a horse stable licking his fingers after pulling maggots from the wound of a dead dog. Every morning he drank rainwater that had mixed with cow dung. Every night he slept between 2 pigs, one male, one female, like 2 walking petri dishes. And the miracle was, he lived. No cough, no fever, no diarrhea. He even survived the dysentery outbreak that wiped out his entire village. His immune system, if bottled and sold, could probably fetch billions of dollars on Amazon. Meanwhile, your kid gets a mild fever and you book a pediatrician. You get a cough and reach for antibiotics. You smell a bit of mold and replace your entire sofa set. You believe that cleanliness is next to godliness, and you are right, except for the small fact that your body is as weak as, well, you know. The modern world wraps you in plastic antibacterial hand wash and vacuum-sealed meals. But no one tells you that when you kill all the germs, you also kill your allies. With no enemies to train against, your immune system turns into a flabby security guard. Irritable, slow to react, and quick to shoot innocent bystanders. The result: you are allergic to cats, dust pollen, even the morning air. Osric. He played with rats, dug his hands into mud, and waded through buffalo urine. And his immune system responded like a Navy SEAL. No medicine, no vaccines, just dirt. But the kind of powerful dirt. Scientists call it the hygiene hypothesis. But to put it plainly, dirty makes you strong. Children raised on farms are less likely to have asthma. People who work with soil have a more diverse microbiome. The intestines of ancient villagers contained strains of beneficial bacteria that today we can only find in $40 probiotic capsules. But no pill compares to a childhood spent face first in the mud. No spa treatment is more luxurious than a night's sleep on soil flecked with chicken droppings. You think you are living clean. The truth is, you are living in a sterilized bubble on the verge of extinction. And when the next strange virus shows up, you will be the first to drop. Not Osric. He can chew raw liver, drink unpasteurized milk, get licked by a dog, and still flash a toothless grin, because his body was not taught to avoid dirt. It was taught to fight. So the real question is, do you want to live inside a clean bubble, or live in a body that can kiss the ground and survive your choice? Astrid closed her eyes, drew the curved knife from its leather sheath, and sliced the still warm liver in half. The scent of iron rushed to her nose like a fragrance signaling life. She did not cook it, did not sauté it, did not add salt. She simply held it in her hand and bit down hard. Blood still seeped. The liver was slightly bitter, slightly smooth like a rich layer of butter. Astrid had never heard of E. coli. All she knew was this: when her little daughter had a fever, she gave her liver. When her mother had a persistent cough, she made soup from bone broth and wild herbs. And when she herself felt drained after a long winter, she bit into a piece of raw liver and kept on living. Modern people would call that madness, a flirt with death, an ignorant act devoid of hygiene. But in the freezing hills of 13th century Western Wales, Astrid had no other choice. No refrigerator, no health care, no concept of sterilization. The liver came straight from a freshly slaughtered sheep, placed on a clean stone cut and eaten on the spot. If there was dirt, fur, or flies, it only added more immune seasoning. Astrid was part of a world modern people have forgotten, a world where life was not pasteurized, a world where the immune system did not lounge on a lab chair, but waded through sewage, leapt into the stomach, and fought like Spartan warriors. Raw liver contained billions of bacteria, both beneficial and harmful. But it also carried the very things you pay hundreds of dollars for at Whole Foods: vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin B12, heme, iron, folate, all in their most bioavailable forms. No processing, no packaging, no advertising, just a piece of liver and a body ready to digest it without fear. In 2017, a research team at Stanford published a study showing that people with a more diverse gut microbiome had stronger anti-inflammatory responses, were less prone to chronic illness, and had more balanced immune systems. The strange thing, that microbiome did not come from pills, but from dirty food, rare meat, wild greens, unpasteurized milk, soil, manure, and of course, raw liver. In Astrid's village, no one had a refrigerator. Meat hung in stone cellars, dried by the wind. Milk was shared fresh from the cow, unboiled, unfiltered, still cloaked in a thick cream. They ate naturally fermented dark bread, sour to the taste, speckled with green mold. They had never heard of penicillin, yet they lived on those moldy bits long before Fleming named it. Their dirt was what kept them alive, what trained their immune system like a martial artist, struck lightly each day so when a real punch came, they would not fall. Astrid once had diarrhea for 3 days after drinking clabbered milk, but she took no medicine. She ate flaxseed porridge, rested, and recovered, because her body had learned to face adversity. But what about you? You panic at the sight of a slightly pink piece of meat. You toss out milk that is only 1 day past its expiration date. You believe pasteurization is brilliant, and indeed it is for urban societies. But if stripped of microwaves and antibiotics, would you survive like Astrid? The question is not whether you should eat raw liver. The question is, once upon a time, people lived without the sterile layers wrapped around everything. And in that time, their bodies knew how to adapt, regulate, and defend. Just like Astrid, who survived winters on nothing but moss, raw liver, and bone broth. Her immune system did not merely fight illness, it coexisted with microbes, learned which to befriend and which to destroy. Today, we fill our guts with probiotics in plastic jars, drink from carbon-filtered faucets, and take pills for every slight stomachache. But our immune systems remain confused. never given a chance to practice. They have been isolated from the dirty nature Astrid once ate raw each day. So when a real pathogen comes, like Salmonella E. coli or RSV, our bodies panic, overreact, misfire, collapse. Once Astrid saved her son by having him drink fresh blood from a sheep's heart, an ancient village ritual for weak children. Not because the blood had magic, but because it was the closest thing to living food the body had ever known, rich in iron enzymes and natural antigens. No modern researcher would dare recommend it today, because we have grown too accustomed to clean. But that very cleanliness, when unchecked, may become another form of poverty, a poverty of survival ability. Astrid never used the word bioavailability, but with each bite of liver, she absorbed more micronutrients than a multivitamin pill. She never spoke of microbiomes, yet within her gut, hundreds of microbial species lived in harmony, regulating emotions, fighting inflammation, clearing toxins. The very things modern research now spends hundreds of millions of dollars trying to understand. You may think we are more advanced, and in many ways, you are right. But when you look at your fragile gut, your erratic immune reactions, and your habit of reaching for pills at the first sign of trouble, you must ask yourself, have we become so clean that we have grown foolish? Astrid was never vaccinated, yet she had no chronic disease. She died at the age of 72 after giving birth to 6 children and surviving 3 pandemics, not because she was stronger, but because her body never forgot how to protect itself, even when surrounded by blood flies and a still warm liver. Edric ran freely among the freshly heaped graves, his bare feet caked with mud, his face smudged with soot from the hearth. Whenever it rained, the cemetery next to his house flooded, and the village children would race to toss stones across the still open burial pits. Laughter echoed among the leaning tombstones. Nearby cartwheel tracks marked the path of the dead, the smell of rotting flesh, of dried flowers of rain soaking into earth, all blended into the scent of childhood that Edric would never forget. He felt no fear, no disgust, no emotional contamination as modern people might call it. To Edric and the village children, human bones were toys, graves were perfect hiding places, and death was nothing more than an old name tied to the ringing of church bells. Edric lived in the 12th century in a small village in northern England right beside the village cemetery. His stone cottage stood no more than 2 walls away from a mass grave. People died of fever, typhoid, or infected wounds, their bodies wrapped in coarse cloth and buried directly in the earth, no coffins, no formalin. Sometimes, after long rains, the ground would sink. Bones would rise to the surface like an exposed nightmare. But no one paid much attention. The children played around it, as if the bones were enchanted relics buried by fairy tales. Today, if a child even sees a picture of a human skeleton, parents rush them off to psychological counseling. For Edric, it was just another day. Not just bones, but the stench of the dead buzzing flies, sobbing voices, and the occasional reopening of old graves to make room for new ones. And yet, strangely, he was never depressed, never panicked, never suffered from post-traumatic anxiety disorders. On the contrary, Edric grew up healthy, slept soundly, ate heartily, and could finish a bowl of thin porridge beside a grave without thinking anything was amiss. No one in his village had ever heard of psychology. But the elders would say, living next to death helps you live better. And it was true. It was not just his mind. Edric's body also adapted to a microbial environment denser than that of any modern hospital. He once picked up a human tooth, still clinging to blackened gums and reeking of rot, and brought it home like a trophy. He once sat on a grave marker, scooped up mold from burial cloth with his hands and threw it at his friends. And he never got sick. No diarrhea, no sore throat, no rashes. Only once did he have a 3-day fever. His mother covered him in leaves and boiled ash water, and he recovered. Today, city children live in plastic boxes. They never play in mud, never touch wild plants, never smell manure or carrion, and they never develop a truly seasoned immune system. Allergy rates rise, asthma rates rise, autoimmune disorders spread. Modern scientists are beginning to realize children need bacteria, need dust, need exposure to diverse microorganisms to properly train their immune systems. When the immune system is not trained, it overreacts to harmless things, like pollen, dog fur, even proteins in breast milk. Edric was different. His body had been exposed to thousands of biological agents from a young age, both benign and dangerous, and learned to tell them apart. His immune cells were like border guards trained in real combat from childhood, calm, precise, and always ready. Once during a mild epidemic, he helped his father dig graves. As they pulled back a burial shroud, a rib bone fell out, still clinging with dark fungus-like tissue. His father picked it up, murmured a prayer, and kept digging. Edric saw it and felt nothing unusual. Death was simply a part of life. So were microbes. That is the key when you grow up among microbes and death. You become not only physically stronger, but mentally braver. No more false emotional cleanliness. No more panic at the first fever. No more treating death like a trauma that needs antidepressants. Modern research is starting to return to the concept of environmental microbes, organisms living in soil, air, decaying bodies, and other natural ecosystems. Contact with these from early life helps the immune system identify true threats, instead of attacking the body itself. That is why children raised near farms, forests, or cemeteries are often healthier, less prone to allergies, and more resilient emotionally. Edric's story is not a scary fairy tale. It is a reminder we used to live this way, and we used to be much stronger. Instead of fearing the dirty, we learned to live with it, both biologically and emotionally. Perhaps what weakens the modern generation is not just poor nutrition or lack of exercise, but a lack of experience with nature's darkness, corpses, bacteria, fungi, and fear. We cover it all with medicine, filtration, and therapy, only to find ourselves more fragile than ever. Edric may not have known how to read, but he understood one truth: no immune system grows strong in a sterile room, just as no heart matures without ever laughing beside a grave. Thorgil remembered that winter vividly. The cold sliced through skin. The wind whipped like lashes through the stone cracks of the fortress. His youngest brother Ivar developed a fever. Red rashes broke out all over his body, and white foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. On the 3rd day, he convulsed, and then fell silent. In the 3 days that followed, 3 more villagers died. They called it the Red Illness, something as fierce as fire and as swift as wind. No one knew what it was. Much later, medicine would call it smallpox. Thorgil was 10 years old. He too developed a fever. His skin broke out in spots. His vision blurred. On those long, feverish nights, he lay on a bed of dry grass under a sheepskin blanket, his mother giving him sacred herb water and whispering prayers into his ear. He did not die. On the 5th day, the fever subsided. On the 7th, he opened his eyes. On the 12th, he stood up and looked into a pool of water and saw a face scarred all over. But he had lived, and surviving smallpox meant he had become an invincible warrior. In those times, there were no vaccines, no face masks, no way to stop a virus except hope, herbs, and faith. Survivors of such plagues were not just lucky, they were forged by fire. Every cell in their bodies now remembered the enemy and stood ready if it ever returned. Thorgil grew up with a body marked by scars, but also filled with antibodies. When the smallpox outbreak struck again 4 years later, the village was gripped by fear. But not Thorgil. He knew he could not be infected again. His body had learned, had remembered, and had built its own fortress of immunity. Thorgil's story is a raw illustration of an ancient truth, one that still holds today about the immune system. The survivor is stronger than any antibiotic. Adaptive immunity is not something you are born with. It is something you acquire through each illness, through every brush with life and death. Today, vaccines allow us to gain immunity without suffering. That is a miracle. But at the same time, it makes us forget that there was once a time when the immune system had only 2 choices: learn or die. And most of humanity chose the first path. Many perished. But those who survived became nearly indestructible. Thorgil later became a warrior on the frontier. The scars on his face made people wary, but struck fear into his enemies. Some said he could not be infected. Others claimed he had once walked through a ward of the dying without flinching. That was no miracle. That was biology. An immune system trained through blood fever and time. Modern science now distinguishes 2 types of immunity: innate, immediate, and indiscriminate, and adaptive, meaning it remembers. Thorgil was never vaccinated, but after surviving smallpox, his body produced antibodies that remembered the virus. That is why he never fell ill again. And that very principle is the foundation of every vaccine today, to introduce a weakened version of the enemy into the body, so the immune system can learn to fight without paying the price of death. But there is something deeper. Thorgil's body did not just remember the virus. It learned balance between attack and recovery. It knew when to fight and when to relent. A strong immune system is not one that attacks everything, but one that knows when not to react. And to develop that ability, sometimes you must get sick. You must run a fever. You must lie breathless and then overcome. Today, we fear fever. At 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, we reach for medication. Every cough calls for a prescription. But to Thorgil, fever was what made him human. It was how the body trained its army. It was the warning trumpet. No one in the village could escape smallpox. But those who survived became essential links in evolution, carrying genes, antibodies, and cellular memories passed down to future generations. Thorgil never knew the term immunological memory, but his body remembered through battle. And that body stood as a bridge between the era when humans were slaughtered by bacteria and the age when we could engineer vaccines through biotechnology. He was the middle chapter where life understood its defenses without needing a laboratory. So when you enter flu season or face a new pandemic and find yourself asking, "Why do I get sick so easily?" remember that perhaps your body has never truly been tested. Thorgil endured his final exam at the age of 10. And from that moment on, no virus ever frightened him again. Immunity is not just a medical concept. It is a memory etched deep in each cell, written by those moments you thought you would not survive. And if Thorgil has one lesson to offer, it is this: sometimes you must be wounded to learn how never to be wounded again. Willa washed her hands in a basin of muddy water, not to get clean, but to begin her workday. Beside her stood a waist-high pile of dried buffalo dung, releasing a sharp, earthy scent tinged with the sour heat of fermented grass. She crouched down and mixed rotting straw with pig manure, then stepped in barefoot to mash it into a thick, muddy paste, the golden substance that would nourish the mustard fields. A light rain had fallen that morning, softening the dung more than usual. She smiled, not because it smelled good, but because it was easier to work. Willa lived in Kent in the south of England in the early 14th century. She was no ordinary farm girl. She was a compost maiden, a professional manure mixer entrusted with keeping the agricultural lands fertile. No one in the village saw her job as disgusting. On the contrary, it was a respected trade. Manure was gold. It was life. Without manure, there were no crops. Without crops, no wheat. Without wheat, no bread. And without bread, no God. Willa had never heard the word probiotic or the phrase beneficial microbes. But every day she immersed herself in a sea of creatures so small they could not be seen. She did not know their names, only that, when her hands sank deep into the warm manure, something happened. The soil came alive. The vegetables grew greener. The people who ate them grew stronger. And she herself, who had handled tons of manure, had never suffered a serious illness. Today, contact with animal feces is treated as an emergency requiring sterilization. People wear gloves, spray alcohol, and isolate themselves. But in Willa's time, manure was a friend. It was the foundation of ecology. And unknowingly, it was the greatest school the immune system ever had. The bacteria in manure E. coli lactobacillus, Clostridia, and thousands of others were potential threats, but also teachers. They taught Willa's body how to distinguish danger from harmlessness. And through daily exposure, her immune system became refined, balanced, not overreactive, not oblivious. A study from Ghent University in Belgium showed that people raised in rural areas with exposure to livestock manure, soil, and mud had gut microbiomes that were 30 to 50% more diverse than those of urban residents. That diversity is not just a number, it is a shield, a map that helps the body navigate the microbial world. Without it, our immune systems behave like rookie soldiers, either panicking or firing wildly. Willa had no medical knowledge, but she had a body that never suffered allergies, never misfired. When sickness swept the village colds, sore throats. Dysentery people came to Willa first, asking for a handful of lucky soil from the very compost she had mixed. They believed there was something in it that protected her. Maybe it was faith. Maybe it was true. Once Willa cut her leg deeply while pushing a cart of manure. Blood flowed. Mud seeped into the wound. To the modern mind, this was a biological disaster. But Willa simply wrapped it in rough cloth, applied ash, and chewed wild chamomile leaves. 4 days later, the wound had dried uninfected. No antibiotics, no ambulance. She simply believed if the body is trained properly, it will know how to handle itself. Willa's compost heap teemed with fungi decomposing bacteria, earthworms, and larvae. All of it would be called filth today. But it was also a source of enzymes, natural antibiotics, and organic acids, the very compounds we now seal into capsules and sell in pharmacies. Willa never took probiotics. She lived with them. Children in the village often played near Willa's workspace. At first, they were scolded, but soon parents noticed the ones who played in mud got sick less often. Dry noses, strong throats, no skin rashes. They began to allow it as long as the children did not eat raw manure, a wise compromise between instinct and immunity. Today, people spend money on yeast supplements, drink probiotic shakes, eat fermented yogurt. But no one mentions that a single summer working barefoot in a field will give your body more microbial strains than 3 months of probiotics. Nature does not need packaging. Nature just needs you to dare to get dirty. Willa had never traveled far from her village, yet she was part of a cycle bigger than any doctrine. She kept the soil alive, kept the vegetables green, kept the village's microbiome thriving. And in return, the soil, the dung, the mud kept her alive. Every time she inhaled ammonia, every time she touched the decaying innards of cattle, her body recorded a new strain. Not to destroy, but to coexist. When you recoil at the sight of dog feces on the sidewalk, remember Willa. She once stood in a sea of manure, smiling and inhaling the air like she was breathing in life. She never had asthma, never had seasonal allergies, never feared mold, because her body had adapted to dirt and learned to turn it into a weapon. Willa's story is a reminder we once did not fear filth. And because of that, we once lived healthier lives. Today, in a world obsessed with sterility, our bodies are forgetting how to react. And when the real enemy arrives, we panic, hands clasped in prayer for medicine. But maybe what we really need is a morning in the mud to remind our bodies of what Willa always knew: dirt does not kill us. Forgetting how to live with it, that is the real danger. Brother Caedmon never cut his hair. His long gray locks fell to his shoulders, sometimes tied back with a strand of hemp. He lived in the monastery of Lindisfarne, a stronghold of devotion nestled in the mist and cold stone of northeastern England. There were no ambulance sirens, no pharmacies. But in a small wooden chest beside his bed, he kept a treasure more valuable than gold: a bundle of green mold, an aged garlic bulb, a few roots of wild ginseng, and a jar of powder made from willow bark. These were the medicines of the 13th century. No tablets, no clinical standards. Yet Brother Caedmon had saved dozens of lives using these so-called filthy remedies. When someone burned with fever, he brewed a tea from willow bark. When someone coughed blood, he crushed raw garlic with honey and stone moss. When a wound turned foul-smelling, he packed it with powdered mold and whispered prayers. Centuries later, modern medicine would learn willow bark contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin. Garlic contains allicin, a powerful antibacterial agent. That green mold, Penicillium notatum, the very fungus Fleming would later use to discover penicillin. Brother Caedmon knew none of these chemical names. He only knew one thing: wherever there was a moldy scent, there was a chance to survive. All around him, the world was being strangled by plague. When the Black Death reached the monastery, only 3 souls remained. People burned their clothes, abandoned villages, blamed witches and demons. Caedmon walked straight into the infirmary carrying a jar of aged garlic soaked in vinegar and a handful of dried lichen. He believed blindly but rightly that nature's filth was stronger than any curse. Modern people take antibiotics because doctors prescribe them. But in the Middle Ages, survival depended on ancient intuition, watching moss grow on stone, smelling fermentation, tasting bitter sap from wild trees. Caedmon trusted that intuition, and for good reason. He survived 3 plagues. He never fell ill, never developed allergies, never had a chronic cough. When he ground green mold into powder and sprinkled it on wounds, he had no idea he was placing penicillium into a battlefield of staph bacteria. But his body, with an immune system trained in mud rot and blood, recognized the scent and knew what to do. No panic, no inflammation, just work. Today we wash our hands 20 times a day and still feel anxious. We take multivitamins and still suffer gut disorders. We fear mold, fear smells, fear herbs for being unscientific. But it was these very molds that once saved humanity. Before chemotherapy, before endoscopy, before gene sequencing, we lived because of things we now call dirty. Brother Caedmon did not live to see the day modern medicine honored mold. But he left behind a notebook filled with hundreds of remedies from swamp herbs' roots that grew near graveyards and tree sap that smelled like urine. No publications, no peer reviews, but people survived, and that was enough. One night he treated a girl with a leg infection, swollen, oozing pus. The villagers said it should be amputated. Caedmon sat beside her, applied mashed mold and honey to the wound, and prayed for 3 days. On the 4th day, the pus retreated, and the skin flushed pink again. Not because he was a saint, but because when the immune system meets the right microbes, it knows what to do. Today, researchers study postbiotics compounds created by bacteria that reduce inflammation and boost immunity. But Brother Caedmon breathed postbiotics every day in the musty monastery cellar where damp earth and fungi grew quietly. Herbs, molds, garlic, onions. These were the original antibiotics. No refinement, no packaging, no barcodes. But no resistance either, no side effects. And more importantly, they taught the immune system how to live with the microbial world, not to destroy it completely. We now eliminate all bacteria, good and bad, and then complain about gut inflammation, allergies, insomnia, and anxiety. Brother Caedmon did not eliminate. He offered the body the right cues so the immune system would know what to do. Like a guidepost, not a substitute. People fear mold. But mold saves lives. They fear raw garlic, yet allicin in garlic is in some cases stronger than amoxicillin. They fear herbs because dosage is imprecise, but Caedmon measured by life itself. If you are still breathing, the dose is enough. You may think yourself more advanced, and you are. But does your immune system, raised on pills, pasteurized food, and antibacterial soap, still remember how to live with nature? Or does it only know how to resist and burn out? Caedmon died at the age of 77 in his sleep, with no illness, no pain. Inside his body, millions of bacteria, fungi, and enzymes coexisted like a long-trained army. They needed no doctor. They only needed not to be severed from nature. We do not need to live like Brother Caedmon. But we must remember, in what we now call filth generations once found life. And in our sterile modernity, we may be losing the final thread of self-repair. Isabeau survived while her entire neighborhood fell. It was not a miracle. It was a paradox. And within that paradox lay a secret that modern medicine is still struggling to understand. In 1348, when the Black Death struck Marseille, the church bells rang all night. Not for Mass, but to count the dead. In less than 8 weeks, 60% of the city's population vanished from the world, leaving only bodies. No one knew why. People burned fragrant herbs, prayed blamed comets, witches, the Jews. But the plague kept spreading. Swollen nodes, blackened blood. Death came as swiftly as the hot wind of June. One sneeze could be a death sentence. But Isabeau, a 22-year-old baker, lived. She lived through all 3 waves of the plague. No medicine, no help. No one knew how. Each morning she wiped down her bakery with a damp cloth, dipped her hands in flour, and lit the wood oven. Her customers died off. Neighboring homes stood empty. But she kept breathing. No fever, no buboes. Her blood stayed red, her bread stayed golden, her yeast still rose. While doctors wore bird-shaped masks, carried sticks, and scattered vinegar and lavender around themselves, Isabeau simply wore a woolen scarf, a cross, and kept kneading dough. Some said she was a witch. Others said she was blessed. She believed nothing, only knew one thing: she had never been sick. 600 years later, geneticists discovered something strange. Some survivors of the Black Death carried a genetic variant called CCR5D32, a mutation that helped immune cells block invading viruses. The same variant is found in some modern individuals resistant to HIV. Perhaps Isabeau carried that gene. Perhaps her blood held a biological shield science had not yet named. But it was not only genetics. There was something else. She was not afraid. While others died of fear through isolation, withdrawal from life, Isabeau continued to live among the plague as if it were simply a toxic rainy season. She ate bread leavened with wild yeast, drank unboiled water, lived in a stone house with no ventilation. She inhaled air that smelled of death, heard crying all day. But her heart did not race. Her immune system did not spiral. It stood still, then reacted when it had to. Today, we call that immune regulation. A healthy body is not one that only attacks, but one that knows how to wait. Knows when a real enemy appears and when it is just the wind. People like Isabeau did not overreact. No fevers when there was no threat. No inflammation caused by panic. She may have carried a rare gene, but perhaps she was simply the product of a world always dirty, always dangerous, where the body had learned to stay calm amid everything. Isabeau once licked her fingers after cracking a raw egg. She did not boil her water. She did not sterilize her knives. But she also did not drink detox teas, take digestive enzymes, or spray disinfectants around her home. Life continued as usual. In a modern world, she would be labeled a hygiene hazard. But in her world, normal meant embracing filth, and immunity meant embracing learning. When scientists examined remains from Black Death cemeteries, they found a significant number of CCR5D32 carriers among the survivors. More frightening was the fact that these individuals passed the gene down for generations. That is how pandemics do more than choose who lives, they choose who lives next. The immune system is genetically filtered by disease. Nature is the most brutal, blood-soaked laboratory there is. Isabeau never knew the word gene, never understood the immune system. But her body was a living map responding at the right time, not too early, not too late. She once dressed the wounds of the infected, placed her hand on their foreheads, washed cloths in well water, wore no protective robes, and she lived. Today, if you cough, you get tested. If you run a fever, you take pills. If you lose your sense of smell, you isolate. But can your body raised in a sterile environment still remember how to respond? Or does it only know how to panic? Isabeau survived not by avoiding the plague. She survived because her body was familiar with the battlefield. No clean rooms, no safe spaces. Every day she touched a microbial swarm and learned something new. Like an old soldier who had tasted blood and seen corpses, she did not flinch at the next battle. She died in 1380 of old age while baking bread. In her hands, still dusted with flour, bacteria and life. Isabeau was no superhero. She was simply one of the few chosen by nature to leave behind a lesson. Immunity is not a wall, it is memory. And to gain that memory, sometimes you must live surrounded by death. Elric stood at the graves of his wife and young son and did not cry. 3 days had passed since they died of dysentery. People said he was cold-hearted or that he had lost his mind. But Elric was not mad. He was simply continuing to live. In his mind, something held him together, not reason, and certainly not courage, but an invisible thread called faith. He had no family left, only a crumbling monastery, a crooked wooden cross, and a prayer he repeated each morning. You take away, but you also preserve. It was not theology. It was a survival mechanism. Elric had never studied medicine, but he understood something deeply ancient. Grief is part of existence, not something to be cured. When his loved ones died, he did not seek therapy. He did not take pills. He did not detox his emotions. He dug graves, laid his head on the earth, and breathed. In 2022, researchers at the University of Pittsburgh found that individuals with deep religious belief had significantly lower levels of cortisol, the stress hormone following major life events. Another study in Japan showed that meditation and prayer increased natural killer cells, those that directly destroy viruses and cancer cells. The things Elric did, bowing his head in prayer, singing hymns alone in the rain, may have been what kept his immune system working while others collapsed from fear and exhaustion. During a plague death, travels not only through the gut or the lungs, but through despair. People poisoned themselves, lit themselves on fire, hung from beams. Those who survived were not just the strongest, but those with a reason to keep going. Elric did not want to die because he believed God was testing him. That belief could not be proven, but it operated like an ancient form of immunotherapy, powerful and cheaper than any vaccine. Elric still baked bread. He still gave it to the orphans in the village. No one understood why he never fell ill. Others had merely touched his wife's corpse, but he embraced her and lived. He kissed his lifeless son's forehead and lived. He said simply, "I am not afraid because God is watching." Modern psychology calls it a protective belief system. A powerful belief can reduce systemic inflammation, stabilize heart rhythms, lower cortisol, and even influence the expression of immune-related genes. The immune system does not only respond to microbes, it responds to emotions. When you feel fear, isolation, and helplessness, the system falters. But when you have purpose, connection, and ritual, it functions with precision. Elric never read those studies, but he lived them. Every morning he washed his hands in the stream, placed his hand over his chest, and sang a song his late wife used to sing. Not to forget, but to remember. To remember that pain is real, and still life goes on. The presence of sorrow was proof of something sacred, and the immune system, like the soul, responds to the sacred. Today, people treat everything with medicine: insomnia with sleeping pills, heartbreak with antidepressants, anxiety with sedatives. But the more they consume, the weaker they become. Not because the medicine is wrong, but because faith is replaced by chemicals. The body forgets how to heal itself. The immune system stops receiving the signal. You will be okay. Elric once told a child in the village, "Every time you pray, it is as if you give your inner soldiers a clear command." And perhaps that is exactly right. Every prayer is a biological signal, a neuroimmune regulator. Not superstition, but the deepest survival instinct of our species, passed down since the caves. The monastery where Elric lived had one old room where monks used to sing all through winter, starving, shivering. Not to summon rain or bread, but to keep a flame alive, to hold rhythm, to prevent the spirit from snapping, and, in a domino effect, to keep the immune system from collapsing. Elric lived to be 78. He died while helping to rebuild a rooftop after a storm. No illness, no medication, never alone. In a body that had once inhaled ashes, eaten moldy gruel, touched corpses, and still survived. Because he never forgot, the body is a battlefield, and the will is its commander. A commander not strengthened by vitamins or vaccines, but by something invisible called belief. You do not need to believe in God. But if you lose every reason to keep going, then medicine becomes meaningless. If you do not believe you will recover, your body does not fight. And the immune system, like a wild wolf, must be led by will, not orders from outside. Elric is the reflection of a time when survival did not rest in the hands of doctors, but in whispered prayers during a winter night, and perhaps in a world flooded with pills, test tubes, and disinfectants. What we need to remember is this: some battles are only won when you truly believe you deserve to live. Finn lived in a sterile apartment. Every wall was painted with antibacterial coating. The air passed through 3 layers of HEPA filters. Everything was deodorized, disinfected, and deemed absolutely safe. The doorknobs were coated in nano-silver. His tiny feet never touched the ground thanks to ultra-clean rugs and imported antimicrobial playmats from Switzerland. Finn was allergic to cats, to pollen, to cashews, and even to grass. Each morning his mother wiped the room with a sterilized cloth. Antibacterial spray was used like a prayer ritual. Finn was not allowed in the park if the air pollution index exceeded safe levels. He took probiotics, multivitamins, and omega-3. He had a private doctor, and his meals were measured by the gram. And yet Finn was still sick, still coughing, still plagued by allergic rhinitis, still pale, thin, and weary, like a seedling forced to grow inside a test tube. 700 years ago, a boy named Edric was also 7. But unlike Finn, Edric played in pigsties. He rolled in mud mixed with animal blood. He picked stones in graveyards, threw hay and dirt at his friends. His hands were scratched, his feet as tough as bark. Edric had never heard of the word immunity, but the immune system inside him worked like a seasoned army because it was trained every single day. Edric had no allergies. He could eat anything, sleep anywhere, even pick up a piece of bread from the ground and eat it without getting sick. He once had a bone splinter lodged in his hand, wrapped it with an old rag, and it healed in a few days. No antibiotics, no hand sanitizer, no face masks. But he lived. Modern scientists call this the hygiene hypothesis, the idea that living too cleanly prevents the immune system from learning how to distinguish friend from foe. Without bacteria, without mud, without dust, the body turns on harmless things, pollen food sometimes, itself. The modern immune system panics like a rookie soldier with no battlefield experience. Finn is cared for like a princess in a laboratory, but that very cleanliness is making him fragile. In a society that avoids contact with microbes, with soil, with reality, the immune system has become a lost traveler. It no longer knows whether to fight or not. It shoots at random. And the result, allergies, asthma, autoimmune diseases, anxiety, depression. Edric was the opposite. Each fall taught his body. Each fever matured his immunity. He grew up among manure and carcasses, things the modern world sees as hazardous. But that environment was the biological cradle of humankind. Not clean, not sterile, but real, and perhaps better. A study in Sweden compared farm-raised children with city children. The results showed children on farms had an 80% lower risk of developing allergies. Their gut microbiomes were more diverse, their immune regulation stronger, their autoimmune disease rates lower. Not because they ate cleaner, but because they were naturally dirtier. Finn, despite maximum protection, requires medication almost year-round. Edric had only soil well water and a torn wool sweater. But Edric knew how to live in the real world. Finn, he is growing up in a virtual one, clean, sanitized, safe, but disconnected from every signal of nature. No one is saying we should abandon hygiene, but there is something more frightening than bacteria, a body that no longer knows what to do when it meets bacteria. When you live in a sterile bubble, you never get a chance to train. And when that bubble bursts, you fall hard. The question is, how much longer until Finn's generation cannot leave the house without a gas mask? How long before real soil, real air, real vegetables must be tested before entering the body? Edric died at 64, crushed by a rock while repairing a barn roof. But he never had a chronic illness, no allergies, no medication. Finn is still alive, but ends up in the hospital at least twice a year. Once for asthma, once for a mild infection. You may be living in the best era in history, surrounded by medicine technology and modern healthcare. But that does not mean your body is stronger. In fact, it might be the weakest it has ever been, unable to breathe dirt, unable to eat garden vegetables, unable to pet a cat without sneezing. And that is the final paradox. Being too clean does not make you healthier. It just makes you easier to break. Perhaps it is time we stop asking, how can we be cleaner, and start asking, how can we be dirty wisely? Because maybe, just maybe, a bit of dirt, a bit of manure, a bite of raw liver is what reminds your body how your ancestors once survived. Not through technology, but through adaptation. On a windless afternoon in the Ohio countryside, 6-year-old Neil Armstrong stood silently by the window. The sky outside was unremarkable, just drifting clouds, a few faint rays of sunlight, and a pale moon slowly appearing in the middle of the day. But in the boy's mind, that moon was not just a distant object. It was a calling, a beacon of something not yet understood but impossible to look away from. He did not know why he was so captivated. He only knew there was a strange feeling inside, a kind of pull, as if the moon were whispering just to him. Come here. Neil grew up during a time when America was still poor, still weary from war, still learning how to believe in tomorrow. But that little boy needed no one to teach him about hope. Neil's sense of faith did not come from church or school. It came from the old airplane engines his father repaired in the backyard, from the humming of propellers spinning in the wind. From the very first time his father took him up in a plane when he was only 5 years old, a short flight lasting less than 10 minutes, but it opened an entire lifetime behind the cockpit door. The boy did not cry, did not scream, did not flinch. He just sat there, eyes wide open, heart still. When the plane touched down, Neil said nothing. But from that moment on, he was no longer the same child. At school, Neil did not stand out. He was quiet, kept to himself. What made him different was the way he looked at things. When the teacher spoke about the stars, he did not take notes like the other children. He drew. He sketched models of spacecraft that had never existed. He drew the barren surface of the moon, though he had never seen it. In his mind, the impossible was the beginning of a question. But what if it were possible? People often imagine geniuses as loud, brilliant forces who draw attention like a flame. Neil was not that way. He was the quiet kind of genius, like the moon itself. Always present, always watching, always moving silently, never demanding to be seen. At the age of 10, Neil built model airplanes from scrap wood using fishing lines and mini engines to simulate spinning blades. When he flew them across the backyard, his mother stood at a distance, heart pounding. She did not understand the numbers he wrote in his notebook, but she understood the look in his eyes whenever he talked about the sky. It lit up as if something electric was inside. Neil grew up in a world that did not yet believe in walking on the moon. In 1940, there were no satellites, no pocket calculators, no manned spacecraft that had ever passed through the atmosphere. But that did not stop the imagination, and sometimes a dream strong enough can change the course of the entire world. By the age of 16, while his friends were dating or playing ball, Neil already had a pilot's license. He got to flight school by flying there himself, paying for his lessons through newspaper delivery, shoveling snow and mowing lawns. His first instructor recalled that Neil showed no fear on his maiden flight, something most beginners struggle with. It was as if he had been born to fly. One afternoon, as he was assembling a model glider in his home, Neil heard a radio broadcast World War II was underway. The earth had slipped into darkness, and boys who loved the sky began to understand that flying was not just about dreaming, it could be life or death. Neil joined the United States Navy and became a naval aviator at just 20 years old, flying combat missions in Korea. But even in the heart of war, he kept a small notebook with him where he mapped flight trajectories, analyzed wind patterns, and wrote down questions without answers. When his aircraft was hit and he had to eject in the middle of a hail of bullets, Neil did not panic. He piloted, calculated, landed in silence. Just as a boy who had been speaking with the moon since the age of 6 always had quietly, precisely, never taking his eyes off the sky. After the war, Neil did not chase medals or glory. He returned to college to study aerospace engineering. In class, he remained the quietest one. But when the professor asked, "Does anyone here believe that one day humans might leave Earth?" only one hand went up. It was his. Years later, when he became a NASA astronaut, Neil still held on to that quiet habit. Among the mission logs, he was the least talkative member of the crew. But once in space, his notes were the most accurate. In a field where being off by even a single millimeter could cost lives, Neil's calm was an irreplaceable gift. And then, destiny knocked. NASA selected him to command Apollo 11, the first mission to land humans on the moon. When he got the news, he simply nodded. No shouting, no trembling, no speech. He just stepped outside and looked up at the night sky. The moon was still there as it had always been. But this time it was no longer whispering. It was waiting. Not everyone dares to dream of flying. And not everyone who dreams dares to take off. In 1950, when the Korean War erupted, America called its youngest to the front lines. Among them was a 20-year-old pilot with a face like steel and eyes that never strayed from the horizon. Neil Armstrong became part of the United States Navy's Squadron 51. He flew the F-9F Panther, a powerful but perilous jet fighter. Up there, he remained a quiet name. But every time he took off, the entire squadron knew that young man would be the one to return. The first time he was hit happened over the Han River. A piece of shrapnel lodged into the wing of his plane. Armstrong maintained speed, banked, and descended to turn back. But the damaged wing left him without control. That should have been the moment to eject. But he did not. He fought to keep the plane level for a few more seconds, just long enough to avoid crashing into the residential area below. Only then did he hit the ejection button. He landed in a grassy field, tumbled across the ground, then stood up and brushed the dust off his uniform. It was not the first time, and it would not be the last. For many, war is a scar. For Armstrong, it was the harshest physics lesson ever taught. Not in a lab with no blackboard or professor. Only force-velocity collision and life or death. After returning to base from a mission, Armstrong usually said nothing. He would go into his room, turn on a dim light, take out his notebook, and begin to draw. Not battlefields, but engine models, ideal flight paths, the descent angle of a spacecraft that had yet to be built. He did not talk about death. He calculated how to avoid facing it again. When the war ended, Neil could have taken the easier path, remain in the military rise in rank, become an instructor. But instead, he returned to the classroom. At that time, America was entering a new era, the era of technology, the space race and dreams beyond the sky. Armstrong enrolled at Purdue University, majoring in aeronautical engineering. He did not study just to know. He studied to understand. Every equation he solved was an investigation. Every model he drew was a larger question. How can humans survive where there is no gravity, no air, no ground to stand on? His friends called him the man from the future because he was never just concerned about tomorrow. He always thought about the day after tomorrow. In the early 1960s, the U.S. government established a secret program called NASA. The goal to send humans into space and then to the moon. No one believed it could happen within a decade, but the Soviets had already taken the lead. In 1961, they launched Yuri Gagarin into orbit. America was left behind. And then President Kennedy said the words that would change everything. "We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard." NASA began searching for the right people. Not just skilled in engineering, but calm as steel, precise as a machine, and willing to put their lives in the hands of untested technology. Armstrong applied. He was not sure he would be chosen, but when they opened his file, there was no doubt. Flawless flight record, combat experience, superior intellect, and one thing that could not be written in a resume, he did not know: fear. Armstrong was selected for the Gemini program, the stepping stone to test the techniques necessary for the journey to the moon. In the Gemini 8 mission, Armstrong became the first to successfully dock a spacecraft with another object in space. But afterward, the craft began spinning out of control at a terrifying rate fast enough to tear everything apart. Armstrong stayed calm, adjusted the auxiliary thrusters, stabilized the ship, and brought both astronauts home safely. On the ground, the mission controllers held their breath. One operator said, "If anyone else had been up there, we would have lost them." The higher Armstrong flew, the quieter he became. He never spoke of bravery. He never claimed to be a hero. He simply said, "I just did the job." To Armstrong, flying was never an adventure. It was a responsibility, a duty to something greater than himself. He did not seek fame. He did not need glory. He only wanted to know, can humans do what only myths have dared to speak of? Once, when asked if he feared death, Armstrong replied, "I think about what I can do with the time I have left." To him, time was not for living long. It was for going far. Men like Neil Armstrong were not born to remain on Earth. They did not come to tell stories. They came to write the first pages of a book the world had never opened. And when the door to the moon began to open, Armstrong was the first to step forward. On October 4th, 1957, a faint beep echoed from the sky. It was not loud, not grand, but loud enough to shake the whole of America. It was a radio signal from the first artificial satellite in human history, Sputnik 1, launched into orbit by the Soviet Union. In that moment, the dream of millions of Americans turned into a nightmare. They were no longer the leaders. They had been left behind. At NASA, the lights stayed on for months. A nation proud of its technological strength now faced the truth they had never launched anything into space, and the ideological rival had done it first. But within that fear, something else arose, a desire stronger than ever before to go further, to rise again, to reclaim faith. President John F. Kennedy did not hesitate. In 1961, he declared to the world, "We will send a man to the moon and return him safely to the earth, not because it is easy, but because it is hard." That statement was not just a goal, it was a vow. But how do you send a person across 238, 855 miles, or about 400 kilometers a distance no one had ever crossed? How do you land on a planet with no atmosphere, no runway, no second chances. NASA had no answers, but they had time, they had intellect, and they had people like Neil Armstrong. After the success and near disaster of Gemini 8, Armstrong became an internal legend. He was not loud, but he was the name on everyone's lips at every meeting. If anyone can stay calm when everything falls apart, it is Neil. NASA had to test everything from zero. They had to learn how to send humans into space and bring them back. Learn to navigate in zero gravity. Learn to live inside a sealed box in a vacuum. Learn how to fly, with no road to turn back. Armstrong trained alongside other astronauts. They were spun at dizzying speeds, submerged in deep tanks for hours, lived in deserts, trekked through jungles. They were isolated from all noise, light, even time, not to perform, but to prepare. Because in space, loneliness has no sound. Neil did not complain. He took notes, calculated, reviewed his logs before sleeping. And every morning, he looked up at the sky as if checking whether the moon was still there. The Apollo program was divided into phases. Each mission bore a number, Apollo 1, Apollo 2, but not all succeeded. In 1967, Apollo 1 exploded during a ground test. 3 astronauts perished in the capsule as fire erupted and no one could open the hatch in time. All of NASA was shaken. Armstrong, upon hearing the news, simply sat in silence. He did not cry. He did not speak. But in his notebook he wrote a single line: "We are stepping through darkness. We must learn not to tremble." Death always lingered near them. Every mission meant writing a will in advance. But Armstrong never called it risk. He called it the cost of understanding. Apollo 8 was the first time humans orbited the moon and saw the Earth rise, a sight no one had ever witnessed from the heart of space. Armstrong was not on that mission, but he looked at the photo sent back and thought, "So beautiful, it cannot be an accident." When the time came, NASA had to choose a crew for the mission that could not fail Apollo 11. A team of 3. 1 commander. 1 person to be the first to set foot on the moon. The man chosen to command was not the loudest, not the most famous, but the one who made the fewest mistakes. Neil Armstrong. Buzz Aldrin. A soldier, a fighter pilot, and a mathematical prodigy, was selected as the lunar module pilot. Michael Collins, calm, disciplined, steady as steel, was assigned to command the service module, the only one who would not step onto the moon. They were not media stars. They were learning machines, training, reconstructing every possible scenario. They knew that a single error, a number, a switch, a faint signal could mean the world would never see them again. And then the day arrived. July 16, 1969. At dawn, the ground at Kennedy Space Center trembled, not from an earthquake, but from a colossal rocket called Saturn V, taller than the Statue of Liberty, poised for ignition. 3 men sat strapped into the command module, listening to the countdown. Armstrong said nothing. He gripped the handle tightly. His eyes did not look at the control panel. He stared straight ahead, as if that metal wall did not exist, as if he had seen what lay beyond it since he was 6 years old. Outside, the entire world was watching. Over 600 million people, from New York to Nairobi, from Tokyo to Tehran. No one moved. 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. That rocket carried more than 3 men. It carried a dream. There is no sound in space, no wind, no waves, no echo. Only silence, absolute, overwhelming, surreal. And in that silence, Apollo 11 drifted like a tiny boat on an eternal black ocean, headed toward a place no one had ever touched. Neil Armstrong looked out the small window. The moon came into view, not full and smooth like in paintings, but rugged, barren, cracked like the skin of a god who had been asleep for billions of years. No green, no water, just gray rock and shadow. A land with no name, with no people. But what held Armstrong's gaze was not the moon's beauty. It was its utter indifference. It did not welcome. It did not reject. It did not care. It simply existed, like a primordial challenge etched into the destiny of humankind. From Mission Control in Houston, engineers transmitted data non-stop. Every step, every command, every heartbeat was tracked. But even with all their preparation, no one could control what would happen when the lander touched down. Eagle, the name of the lunar module, separated from the command ship. Inside, Armstrong and Aldrin ran system checks. The instruments trembled softly. The module rocked slightly as if entering a place untouched by science. Then problems appeared. The guidance computer began to overload. Alarms flashed. A sequence of warnings blinked. 1202, 1201. No one knew exactly what was happening. On the ground, engineers flipped through manuals, called out frantically. One voice shouted, "Keep going! It is not a critical error. We can proceed." The signal was sent. Armstrong heard it. But outside the window he saw something else. The planned landing zone was covered in boulders. If they landed there, the module could tilt and explode. In that moment, Armstrong released the automatic controls. He grabbed the stick, and he chose to land, manually. No one had ever done this before. No one knew if the module had enough fuel to find another site. No one on Earth could help. There was only him, his eyes, and the math whispering through his mind. Altitude dropped. 200 feet, 100 feet, 50 feet, then 20 feet. The whole world held its breath. The fuel gauge warned only 20 seconds left. Then 10 seconds. And finally a voice on the radio. "Houston Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." The control room erupted in applause, tears, and choked exhalations. But inside, the Eagle Armstrong merely nodded. He did not celebrate. He knew landing was only half the story. The other half was stepping outside. The moon remained silent. Neil and Buzz prepared their spacesuits, a process that took hours in a cabin no bigger than a car. They checked every latch, every seal, every air tube. Because out there, mistakes did not mean death. They meant vanishing forever in a realm without time. Roughly 6 hours after landing, Armstrong opened the hatch. The heavy door groaned with each dry creak. He stepped down the ladder. The rungs were not large, but each step was 1,000 years of history. Back on Earth, over 600 million people watched. From black and white televisions in living rooms to military radios, to old transistors in rural diners. Everyone was silent. And then a voice echoed with calm clarity and an almost surreal composure. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. One footstep, one print in lunar dust, a shallow dent that no wind could erase for millions of years. Armstrong did not dance, did not cheer. He did not kneel or salute. He simply walked, observed, and listened. But nothing answered. The moon was a master of secrets. It gave no reaction, no reply. It simply bore witness. And perhaps that was all it ever needed to do. Buzz Aldrin followed. Two men clad in white armor walking across land untouched by any other. They planted the American flag not as a claim of ownership, but as a note. We were here. They placed instruments, collected rocks, took photos, recorded sounds. But among it all, there was a moment few noticed. Armstrong stood still, looking back at Earth. A blue dot no bigger than a fingertip, floating in an ink-black sky. No borders, no countries, no wars. Only home. In that moment, every reason for the race, every political tension, every human calculation vanished. On the moon, Armstrong was no longer just American. He was the embodiment of intellect, of courage, of humanity's tireless curiosity. When they re-entered the module preparing to leave, Armstrong looked back at the footprint in the dust. He did not know if anyone would follow, or how long the mark would remain. But he knew one thing for sure. Humanity had left proof that a dream had come true. And in the silence of the moon, no one heard his heartbeat. But the world heard something far louder, the pulse of history. The distance between the Earth and the moon is not 238,855 miles, or about 384,400 kilometers. It is not something that can be measured with a ruler or a formula. The real distance lies between what humanity dreams and what humanity can achieve. That distance on July 20th, 1969, was erased by three men inside a capsule no larger than a bathroom. After 21 hours of working on the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin prepared to depart. Inside the cockpit of the Eagle module, they packed rock samples, double-checked the data, and compressed their emotions. Before closing the hatch, Aldrin bowed his head in silence. He said nothing aloud, but it was a prayer. Not for survival, but that the world would not forget this moment. Armstrong, as always, gave a slight nod. He left behind no relics, wrote no message. But he did leave the one thing that mattered, a footprint, and a silence full of meaning. When the engine ignited to lift off from the moon, the entire module trembled. If it failed, they would be stranded forever. There was no rescue plan. There would be no second chance. On Earth, sealed in a gray envelope, a speech had already been prepared for President Nixon in the event they did not return. The first line read, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." But they did not stay. Eagle lifted off from the silver dust and soared back into orbit, reuniting with Collins aboard the Columbia module. The three men brought together again after 2 days separated by space, and history did not embrace, did not cry. They simply looked at each other. 3 glances enough to say, "We survived, and we did the impossible." The journey home began. On the way back to Earth through a small window, the planet slowly grew larger. No longer a tiny blue dot, but a radiant sphere spinning quietly in the void. It made no sound, bore no signs, carried no banner that read, "This is home." But for the three men inside that cramped capsule, it was all they needed to see to know they were returning. Inside the spacecraft, food came in gel form, water was compressed, and sleeping meant being strapped to a wall. Yet they did not complain, because each sleep was one day closer to solid ground. Each look out the window reminded them how small they were in both a literal and philosophical sense. Armstrong wrote in the mission log, "From this distance, the conflicts of humanity seem too small to matter." Finally, on July 24th, the Columbia module plunged into Earth's atmosphere at a speed exceeding 24,000 miles per hour, which is about 39,000 kilometers per hour. Friction with the air created fire sheets of flame that engulfed the capsule, blocking all communication for several minutes. On the ground, they called out "Columbia, respond," but no reply came. 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. Silence. Then a voice echoed through Columbia, "Is fine. We see the sky." The entire world exhaled. And once again, Earth opened its arms to welcome back three sons returned from legend. They splashed down into the Pacific Ocean. Navy sailors lifted them from the sea like ancient vases recovered from the ocean floor. Each man wore a silver isolation suit and entered the quarantine chamber. No one hugged them. No one shook hands. Science had not yet ruled out alien bacteria, but no one truly worried, because in that moment, joy far outweighed fear. Televisions across the globe showed the three men behind a glass wall. They waved, smiled gently, but said nothing. In their eyes was something no one outside could truly understand, the gaze of men who had stepped into another world and brought a piece of it back with them. 3 weeks later, when they emerged from quarantine, a new America awaited them. An America filled with pride. An America standing tall amid the Cold War political divides and historical wounds. Because for once the entire planet had paused to look toward one place and realized that humanity, despite its differences, could reach for the divine together. Neil Armstrong became the most famous name on the planet. But he did not change. In every press conference, he spoke of the team, of the science, of the thousands of engineers, programmers, and technicians who had turned a crazy idea into reality. When asked how it felt to be the first human to set foot on the moon, he simply smiled and said, "I was just the one who was given the opportunity to do it." He did not accept ambassador roles, did not run for office, did not endorse products. When asked to make a movie, he declined. When someone wanted to write a biography, he requested no embellishments. He chose to return to a normal life, if one could call it that. He became a university professor teaching engineering to young students who still were not sure whether the moon was real or just a dream. And whenever someone asked, "Do you believe in God?" he would simply reply, "I have seen the moon." I think that is enough to believe in something greater than ourselves. For Armstrong, the journey did not end on the moon. It had only just begun. No one knows exactly when humanity's first footsteps were taken. Perhaps it was when our ancestors rose from the dust of Africa. Perhaps it was when they crossed deserts, scaled volcanoes, and found their way to the sea. But there is one step the entire world remembers, because for the first time, it was not taken on Earth. Neil Armstrong's footprint on the moon made no sound. There was no crunch of soil, no echo, no photographer nearby. Yet hundreds of millions of hearts heard it in the absolute silence. We think we understand the moon, a satellite, a chunk of rock, a romantic nightlight. But when Armstrong set foot on it, he transformed it into something else. No longer just a shape hanging outside the window, it became a part of the human story. The dust he stepped on was unlike any soil on Earth. Fine as powder, yet stubbornly clingy with no wind to carry it away. The footprints he left remain to this day and will remain for millions of years, because nothing can erase them. No rain, no wind, no time. Buzz Aldrin followed behind the two men, moving slowly, more gliding than walking, like spirits exploring another dimension. They spoke little. They did not need to. The space around them said everything. You are in a place no one has ever been. They planted a flag, set up instruments, collected rock samples. Everything followed the mission plan, yet went beyond it. Because no plan accounts for emotion. In a moment, unseen by any camera, Armstrong turned back to look at the lunar module. It was the only doorway home. A narrow metal ladder led up to a fragile box. If it failed, they would become the first and the last to set foot here. He was not afraid, but he understood. No one truly belongs to the moon. It is not a home. It does not sustain life. It welcomes no one. It simply waits in silence for those who dare to touch the impossible. Among the instruments they placed on the lunar surface was a small metal plaque etched with these words: "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind. There was no logo, no brand, no individual names, just one word, mankind." Armstrong and Aldrin stayed on the surface of the moon for just 2.5 hours. But every passing minute was a testament to thousands of years of evolution dreams and failure. They spoke with President Nixon via radio. A call from Earth to the moon, spanning hundreds of thousands of kilometers, roughly 240,000 miles, just to share a few words of congratulations. But that moment was not about politics. It was an acknowledgement that for the first time, a human being stood beyond Earth and spoke to the entire planet as though calling home. Buzz Aldrin called the moon magnificent desolation. And so it was. There was no life there, but also no war, no hatred, no division. It was a vast mirror reflecting humanity, showing just how small and how extraordinary we really are. When they completed their tasks, they climbed back into the module. The hatch closed behind them without a sound. Nothing marked their departure, only footprints, a flag, and silence stretching on forever. On the journey back to the Columbia module, they spoke little. No one sang. No one celebrated. There were only steady breaths and distant gazes. Michael Collins, the third astronaut, had flown alone around the moon while Armstrong and Aldrin made history. He never set foot on the surface, but he held the key to bringing them home. He later said, "I felt like I was the only human not from Earth during that time." When they reunited, there were no drums, no cheers, only a handshake. 3 men, 3 personalities, 3 parts of one indivisible mission. From the moon, they brought back 47.4 pounds of rock and soil, which is about 21.5 kilograms. But the priceless thing they carried home was perspective, a new way of seeing ourselves. Armstrong was not one for philosophy, but in a later interview, he said something that left many speechless. When you see Earth the size of a ball, and you can cover it with your thumb, all the rivalries, all the wars, all the stupidity, it just fades away. There was no halo around him, no glitter of celebrity. But there was one truth no one could deny: Neil Armstrong was the first to lift humanity off the ground. Not with muscle, but with belief. And when he stepped onto that silver realm, he opened a door that could never be closed. Because from that moment on, human beings were no longer bound by gravity. We had placed a period in the universe and begun writing the next chapter in a place where no story had ever begun before. The world expected a hero, a god descending from the moon, glowing in celestial light, ready to deliver immortal speeches, pose with the president, grace the cover of Time magazine, write books, sign autographs, tell stories, and become a symbol. But Neil Armstrong did not do any of that. He returned the same way he had left, quietly, sparingly, with words, and with a calm so strange, it felt as though stepping onto another planet had been just another item on his daily checklist. And when people asked how he felt being the first human to walk on the moon, he merely shrugged. I guess I was just at the right place at the right time. The world was not used to such simplicity. The press swarmed. Television networks called. Hollywood knocked. But Armstrong turned most of it down. He did not write a memoir. He did not frequently appear in public. He did not chase the spotlight. He chose to return to Ohio, to the small hometown where his dream had first taken shape, and became a professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati. In a modest classroom with chalkboards and wooden desks, the man who had traveled farther than anyone who had ever lived now stood lecturing on thrust orbits and wing structures. He did not mention the moon. Students were not allowed to call him a hero. For Armstrong, the greatest legacy was not memory, it was knowledge passed on. And then he gradually stepped out of the world's spotlight. No scandal, no controversy, no public feuds. Just the occasional quiet appearance enough to remind the world the first man was still among us. But he had nothing left to prove. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as the world changed rapidly, wars ended, computers were born, the internet began to stir. Armstrong kept his own pace, slow, deliberate, and deeply reflective. Once a journalist asked him, "After all this, how would you like to be remembered?" He replied, "I think what matters is not me, but what happened." To him, the name Armstrong was less important than the footprint on the moon. No one walks out of space wearing stars on their shoulders. Just a human being with limits, with flaws, but also with unimaginable potential. And so time passed. New generations were born. Children looked up at the moon, unaware that someone had once gone there using technology weaker than the smartphone in their pocket. Young people now live in a world of satellites, global positioning systems, and selfies from space, but not all of them know the name of the first man. Armstrong was not saddened by this, because he had never sought eternity. He once said, "If I am the last person to see the moon from beyond Earth, I would still feel lucky." On August 25th, 2012, Neil Armstrong passed away after heart surgery at the age of 82. The world bowed its head. President Barack Obama wrote, "Neil was among the greatest of American heroes, not just of his time, but of all time." The flag at the White House was lowered to half-staff. At NASA, engineers paused for a moment of silence. In space, the International Space Station sent a quiet message, "We are flying in your footsteps." But Armstrong would not have wanted a grand funeral. He wanted people to move forward, to look ahead, to ask the questions he once asked, and to keep curiosity burning like an unending flame. His family released a brief statement. To honor Neil, the next time you walk outside on a clear night and see the moon shining down at you, think of him and give it a wink. A simple invitation, but poetic, and truer to his spirit than any statue ever could be. Since the Apollo 11 flight, Armstrong never returned to space. But part of him is still there, present in the footprints in the metal plaque in the rocks he brought home, and in every child who looks up at the sky and quietly asks, "Could I go there?" The answer still, as always, is yes, because Neil Armstrong paved the way. He left no legacy in words, but in action, not through a speech, but through a single step, not in thunderous applause, but in silence. A silence that remains the most resounding in human history. In the heart of the Yucatan jungle, where trees rise taller than myths, where the howls of monkeys echo like the voice of time, there stands a small round stone tower, silent and still, as if it were asleep. But it is not. It is watching. This tower, neither tall nor grand nor gilded, was given a strange name by the Maya El Caracol, the stone snail. Its architecture spirals like a human ear curves, like the paths of the stars, and its windows do not face the landscape, they face specific stars. No one ever lived inside. No one was ever buried there. It was not a shelter. It was an eye of civilization, an eye that knows how to open at night. The Maya did not build El Caracol to shield themselves from rain, nor did they erect it to worship their gods. They built it to listen, so that each window could become an echo from the sky, so that every stone crevice could serve as a marker of time, so that every step inside could mirror a rotation of the planet Venus. While other civilizations built pyramids to rise above the earth or temples to assert their power, the Maya quietly raised a round tower not to reach upward, but to turn inward. Not inward toward the ground, but toward the spinning cosmos. The Maya believed that the sky was not far away. It surrounded them, touched them, lived alongside them. There were no gods above, separated from earthly life. On the contrary, the gods were the planets. Venus was the goddess of war and harvest. The moon was the deity of water and fertility. Jupiter was the messenger of transformation. And so every movement in the heavens was a whisper. And El Caracol was built not to stargaze, but to listen to those whispers. Imagine a night thousands of years ago. All of Chichen Itza douses its torches. The sky is moonless. The clouds part. The earth holds its breath. Inside El Caracol, an elder priest without a telescope, without a solar calendar, stands before a narrow window. He waits. At the exact moment Venus appears, he nods. And then thousands of people begin to cut the forest, light the fires, and plant the seeds. There is no command, only the star. In our modern age, we use satellites to observe the universe. But the Maya, thousands of years ago, allowed architecture to watch the sky on their behalf. El Caracol had no guardian. It watched on its own. By aligning its windows with the rising and setting points of Venus, with the spring equinox sun, with the constellations of the summer night, it was as if someone from the heavens had told them, "Build me eyes." And they did. Today, El Caracol stands among broken stone platforms, fallen columns, moss, and roots. No one performs rituals. No one keeps watch for stars. But those windows still gaze skyward. And if you stand there in the right season, on the right day, at the right night, you will see the light of a star shine directly down its inner corridor, as if the gaze continues. No one replies, but the Maya never needed an answer. They did not ask. They listened. El Caracol is not as grand as the pyramids, not as sacred as the temple of Kukulkan, not as mysterious as the holy ball court, but it is the only place that needed no one, because it was born to live among the gods, not their followers. In a world too loud where everyone wants to be seen, El Caracol is the first lesson in how to be silent and look up. Not to admire, not to wonder, but to understand how small we are beneath a spinning universe. Perhaps you have never been to Chichen Itza, never stepped inside El Caracol. But if even once you have stopped to look at the night sky, seen a star flicker and vanish, and felt as though someone just called your name without saying a word, then you have stood inside that tower. Because El Caracol is not stone. It is an idea, an ancient eye forever open in the dark. The Maya did not see the universe as empty space. They saw it as a living body. There was no void, no cold distance between humans and celestial beings. Every planet was a god. Every constellation was a moving soul. And the sky, it was not a backdrop to be painted upon, but the other side of the world. If the earth was the carpet upon which people walked, then the sky was the ceiling where gods paced above. In that world, every celestial event was a story. A solar eclipse was not merely a shadow, it was the moment when the sun god was kidnapped. A lunar eclipse was the instant the goddess of water was swallowed by a giant serpent. The rising of Venus at dawn was not just a phenomenon, it was a sign that the goddess of war had returned and required offerings. The Maya did not need to understand celestial mechanics. They could feel its rhythm like someone sensing their own heartbeat without needing a monitor. From this belief, they built not only temples, but also calendars, a system of timekeeping so precise it astonishes even today. The Tzolk'in calendar, 260 days, guided rituals and human gestation. The Hob calendar, 365 days, tracked the seasons and agricultural cycles. The Long Count calendar recorded cosmic moments with time spans reaching over 5,000 years. No other civilization of the ancient world created a timekeeping system as scientific, as sacred, and as expansive. But their calendars were not kept in books. They were embedded in stone, in architecture, in the way they placed windows, constructed staircases, and positioned columns. Every structure in Chichen Itza, from the temple of Kukulkan to El Caracol, was part of a cosmic clock made of stone. And the Maya did not simply live in a city. They lived within a map of the stars. Strangely, they did not consider this science. They saw it as ritual, Observing the sky was not for study. It was to maintain the sacred order between humans and the divine. If the sun god rose on the correct day, there would be harvest. If Venus appeared too soon, war would come. If a solar eclipse occurred unexpectedly, a ritual must be held at once to calm the angered god. And to foresee such events, they built observatories. Not like Galileo with telescopes, not like Copernicus with heliocentric models. The Maya did not need to know that Earth revolved around the sun. They only needed to know when a light would appear and what it meant. What they built was not a scientific instrument. It was a tool for sensing divine will. That is why their observatories were not mere devices, but the cosmic centers of the community. When a celestial event was near, all rituals changed. Weddings were postponed. Funerals were brought forward. Warriors were chosen. And the priest, the one who read the sky, became the translator between the gods and the world. In a society where the universe was a living body, every action was a response to the heavens. There was no such thing as coincidence. Nothing was natural. Everything was the manifestation of a will greater, stronger, and deeper. And humanity's duty was to listen. Not with ears, but through stone structures, through light, through cycles, through intuition. That is why Chichen Itza was not built according to urban planning. It was constructed following a sacred blueprint. From the alignment of the plazas to the way sunlight touches the steps of Kukulkan's pyramid, from the flow of underground water to the shadow cast by El Caracol. Everything was the expression of a universe that lives, breathes, and sends messages. Not all civilizations looked to the sky the same way. The Greeks turned stars into heroes. The Egyptians linked stars to rebirth. But the Maya did something stranger still. They lived inside the sky, not through imagination, but through architecture. Today, as we look back, we call them ancient astronomers. But to them, there was no such thing as ancient or modern. There were only lights that will return, and when they do, we will know where we stand within the vastness of this universe. In the heart of Chichen Itza, a sacred city of stone where gods are carved into columns and time is etched into every block, there stands a small round structure set apart from the rest. It is unlike the towering pyramid of Kukulkan, unlike the temple of the warriors with its armored reliefs, unlike the blood-soaked ball court where the victor was the one offered in sacrifice. It stands still and round. El Caracol, in Spanish, the snail. No one knows what the Maya originally called it. The name was given by Europeans who saw the spiral staircase winding upward like an ear, as if this temple was not meant for seeing, but for listening. Listening to what? Listening to the sky. Imagine a round stone tower set atop a raised square platform. The lower level resembles an altar. The upper, like a skull with its lid removed, features narrow windows. Windows that do not open to the scenery but to very specific patches of sky. These openings were not placed at random. Some align precisely with the rising point of Venus. Others receive sunlight on the spring equinox. Some are aimed at the horizon point, where the full moon rises highest in its 18.6-year cycle. There is no lavish decoration, no statues of gods, no myths carved into stone. And because of this, El Caracol is even more mysterious than the most ornate temples. The Maya left behind no written explanation. But through careful study, modern archaeologists have come to understand this is an astronomical device, but not in the Western sense. There are no lenses, no levers, no human hand required to operate. Only the movement of the sky and light falling through the right opening at the right time. El Caracol is a covenant of stone between humans and the cosmos. Each year, on the spring equinox, when day and night are balanced, the sun rises directly through the main opening. Light pours down the spiral corridor and then bounces upward to the dome like a surge of energy, lifting the lid of the heavens. On certain nights, Venus will appear through a tiny upper window at the exact moment predicted hundreds of years in advance. The Maya observed the cycle of Venus with astonishing precision because they believed it represented the goddess Chak-Ek, deity of war, harvest, and rebirth. When Venus rose after a long absence, it was a signal for festivals for sowing or for sacrifice. But what makes El Caracol legendary is not just its function. It is the way it is felt like a living being. The spiral corridor resembles a fossilized ear, the domed ceiling a partially opened skull, the stone staircase a spine rising toward a beam of light, and the entire tower an enormous sensory organ left behind by the Maya in the forest, not to testify to power, but to say, "We once knew how to listen." And El Caracol does not only listen to the cosmos, it listens to people too. When a priest walks the corridor, each footstep echoes. The sound loops within the arched space like a call being answered, as if someone beyond the sky is listening in return. Today, the tower is partially broken. Many windows are lost. The staircase has collapsed. The stone worn down by weather, by war, by indifference. Yet what remains still makes El Caracol seem like a sleeping creature, not a dead one. A stone snail that no longer moves but still listens. No longer receiving offerings, but still waiting. No longer inhabited by gods, but still turned toward the sky. In today's world, where everything must serve a function, have a reason, a definition, El Caracol is a living question carved in stone. Why would a civilization spend centuries constructing a tower just to watch a single star? Why build a structure just to catch the light of one day in the year? Why transform architecture into the ear of the universe? Perhaps because the Maya understood something we have forgotten. Not everything is meant to be seen. Some things are meant to be heard. If El Caracol is an ear, then all of Chichen Itza is the body of a god opening its eyes. This was not a city, not a capital, not merely a political, religious, or military center. Chichen Itza was a map of the cosmos carved in stone. Here, no structure was placed by chance. Every direction, every gate, every corridor, every stair held within it an unspoken equation, a prayer in the form of geometry. At Chichen Itza, architecture was not the result of astronomy. It was astronomy. Let us begin at its heart, the Pyramid of Kukulkan. A stepped pyramid rising over 80 feet, about 24 meters tall, with 4 sides. Each side has 91 steps. Total 364 steps. Add the platform at the top 365. 1 year, 1 solar cycle, 1 full turning of the earth frozen in stone. But what made Kukulkan legendary was not just the numbers. It was the movement of light. Every year, on 2 specific days, the spring and autumn equinoxes, the sun strikes the pyramid at a precise angle. Light slips down the edge of the structure, casting a shadow in the shape of a serpent slithering from the summit to the carved serpent head at the base. It is not sculpture, not engraving. It is an image made of light, a ghost of the divine. A serpent of light crawling over stone, visible only when heaven and humanity meet at a perfect point. The Maya used no cement, no wheels, no telescopes. Yet they turned light into a living creature and architecture into a mirror for the cosmos. From Kukulkan, one walks into the Temple of the Warriors, where a statue of Chakmul lies on his back, arms raised to hold a sacred bowl. That bowl received offerings of blood. But it also lies in direct alignment with the highest full moon of the year. On that night, moonlight strikes the bowl and reflects onto the ceiling like an invitation for the gods to descend and receive the sacrifice. Not far away stands the sacred ball court, a strange structure over 490 feet long, about 150 meters, with towering walls, and a circular stone ring mounted more than 23 feet, around 7 meters high, where ancient teams played a game that was never meant for entertainment. This was not sport. It was a reenactment of the heavens, a symbolic battle between the sun and the darkness. The victor was not celebrated. He was sacrificed, because he alone was worthy to become a star. The entire city of Chichen Itza functioned like a sacred machine, each building a cog turning with the sky. Light-shadow echoes the cycle of water, the direction of wind. All were governed not by modern engineering, but by belief and intuitive astronomy. This was not about facing homes in lucky directions. It was about constructing a world in conversation with the cosmos. The Maya did not see architecture as a shell. They saw it as a bridge. They did not use stone to create shelter. They used it to create gateways. Gateways between humans and gods, between earth and sky, between the visible and the unseen. At the height of Chichen Itza, every movement was synchronized. Rituals began when stars appeared. Seeds were planted when the moon reached its peak. Wars commenced when Venus returned. Decisions were made when light passed through a window in El Caracol. No one managed the city. The universe managed it. Today, when standing among the ruins, you may not feel its former glory. But if one day you arrive at just the right moment, and you see the beam of light slicing through Kukulkan, hear the perfect echo at the ball court, watch Venus shine through the window and into El Caracol, you will understand. This city never truly died. It has simply been waiting silently for someone who knows how to listen. There was no final battle, no apocalyptic flood, no invading army raising everything in fire. Chichen Itza did not fall, it faded, like a flame running out of oil, like the divine eyes of a god slowly closing in the dark. No one knows exactly what happened. Only this, by the 10th century, after more than 300 years of brilliance, the stone city began to lose its people. The rituals ceased. The sacrifices were interrupted. The sacred courts were abandoned. The observatory stood empty with no one to keep watch through the night. It was not a dramatic collapse, but a hollowing from within, a slow, invisible decline, and because of that, all the more painful. The Maya were not slaughtered. They walked away. The jungle began to swallow the steps, the temples, the shafts of light they had calculated over centuries. There was no blood, only moss, no cries, only insects replacing prayer. Why? Some say civil war. Others blame a prolonged drought driving people to search for water. Some scholars believe a minor disruption in the cycle of Venus, a cycle upon which all ritual depended, led to incorrect ceremonies and thus a crisis of faith, when the stars no longer appeared at the appointed time, when the prophecies failed to come true, when the sacrifices no longer brought results. The Maya began to doubt, and between doubt and departure there is only silence. El Caracol still stands, but no one steps inside. Its windows still face the stars, but no one stands guard. And slowly, the Maya stopped looking. The tragedy of Chichen Itza is not in its crumbling stones, but in the turning away of eyes. A civilization that once lived to understand the heavens no longer needed the sky. A city built on the axis of the cosmos, replaced by villages that no longer looked to the stars. And perhaps that is the most tragic question of all. What happens when a civilization no longer believes in its own universe? When belief fades, all architecture becomes mute stone. All rituals become empty shells. All celestial maps turn into mazes no one dares to read. The Maya once lived inside the sky. Now, they closed the door and looked down at the earth. They receded into the shadow of the forest. They withdrew from the light of the stars. No conquest erased Chichen Itza. It was the exhaustion of vision that killed it. A quiet death with no bell, no epitaph, but one that echoes endlessly through every window where no one now waits for light. Today, tourists come to see the stones, but within those stones still lie the traces of crystallized light. They were once raised to welcome rays from the heavens. Now they stand as witnesses to the moment when the stars no longer answered. It is the most beautiful and saddest tragedy. Not destruction, but abandonment. Not defeat, but a lost ability to listen to the cosmos. And perhaps the universe never went silent. Perhaps there is simply no one still enough to hear. Chichen Itza may have fallen into silence, but the punctuation marks of the sky still lie embedded in stone. Though the jungle has laid moss across the paths, though light no longer pours into the magical windows, though priests no longer greet the stars with whispered prayers, the structures remain aligned just as they always were. And that alone is enough to make modern astronomers bow their heads. In the early 20th century, archaeologists returned to a land long devoured by the forest. They expected to find scattered ruins, fragments of religious relics. But then they realized they had stepped into a time machine. At El Caracol, despite subtle shifts from centuries of tectonic change, the stone markers still pointed toward the rising of Venus. The windows still channeled the light of the spring equinox, though no one had waited in them for over 1,000 years. The pyramid's columns, corridors, sacred wells, when measured with modern tools, all aligned with complex astronomical models. The Maya did not measure with lenses. They measured with intuition turned into form. Today, scientists use laser scans, 3D modeling, and satellites to reconstruct Chichen Itza. And they discovered it was never a random city. It was a celestial coordinate system where every structure was a marker like punctuation in a cosmic sentence, a sentence that was never finished. What is more, Maya astronomical knowledge continues to inform modern science. The Venus cycle, which they calculated as 584 days, deviates by less than 1 day from NASA's data. Predictions of lunar and solar eclipses based on the long count calendar align with events occurring in the 21st century. Their dual calendar system, Tzolk'in plus Hob, remains one of the most intelligent non-linear models of time ever devised. And so, even though Chichen Itza is no longer a sacred ceremonial ground, it has become an unspoken laboratory for humanity. An ancient star map lying silent in the earth, yet still keeping up with the cosmos. Tourists come to admire the ruins, but unknowingly, they are walking through a fossilized model of the universe. They take photos at the Pyramid of Kukulkan, unaware that they are standing precisely where sunlight touches on the spring equinox. They rest beside El Caracol without knowing they lean against a stellar observatory that once tracked Venus with pinpoint accuracy. They stand in the light, yet no longer hear what the light is saying. There is a sorrow in the rediscovery of heritage. It is like entering an abandoned house and realizing it was once filled with life. The stars were once welcomed like old friends. The moon once beat like a drum to begin a ceremony. Venus once strolled the dawn as a goddess in shimmering light. And you, living 1,000 years later, still walk the very path that the light once followed. Heritage does not lie in what we see. It lies in what remains true after we have forgotten. The Maya did not leave behind textbooks. They left stones that speak, and the sky's punctuation marks, still pressed into every crevice, whisper a single truth. If you would only look up, we are still here. Not every civilization leaves behind an observatory, but the Maya left more than tools. They left a way of being, a life not separated from the sky, a life lived with the belief that the heavens are not far, only silent to those who do not still themselves enough to listen. And so, even though they are gone, we still walk beneath the stars they once followed, in a different way, with different instruments, but guided by the same question: what are we within the essence of the sky? When night falls over Yucatan, and the crowds have left after a day of tourism, amid the stone jungle of Chichen Itza, only the wind and insects remain. And still, El Caracol, the small round observatory, stands, like an eye that has never closed. No one looks up anymore, but the stone windows still face the stars. No priests remain, but the beam of light still falls through the same opening just as it did thousands of years ago. No more prayers are spoken, but the gaze remains. El Caracol does not know sorrow. It simply remains open. And that is its silent immortality. Not endurance through power or glory or conquest, but through the quiet persistence of a gaze still turned skyward. We modern humans may travel to Mars, launch satellites into orbit, explore black holes billions of light years away. But when standing before El Caracol, we must fall silent, because it is the final symbol of something simple that we have forgotten: to be silent and to look. The Maya once believed the universe was a living body. We measure it in numbers. But perhaps those two ways are not in conflict. Perhaps what the Maya built was not blind faith, but another version of knowledge. Knowledge that did not come from telescopes, but from the deep silence of a gaze stretching across centuries. When you stand before that tower, you stand with all those who have looked up before you, and you become one more link in the chain of people who once sought to understand the universe through feeling. No need for answers, only connection. That is why Chichen Itza, though it no longer serves ritual, still accomplishes something greater. It reminds us of our quietest truth, that we as human beings are still creatures of the gaze. We live not merely to survive, but to look and to be looked back upon, not to look at each other, but to look into the universe, to face what is vaster than us, older than us, beyond names and eras. El Caracol does not need to be illuminated. It is lit by the presence of a single glance, even just once. And that is the final question this observatory asks, not of the Maya, but of us. How long until we stop looking up? How long until humanity, having measured everything, loses the habit of lifting its head into the night? Perhaps that is why El Caracol has not fallen. It remains the final symbol of a species that once knew how to look upward. In the chapters of history, there will be more observatories, more technologies, but perhaps nowhere else was ever built solely so that light could pass through a single slit on a single day, so that one star could be heard. Not to control the cosmos, but to remind us that we are still a small part of its great turning. And though every empire may collapse, though every science may evolve, there will still be an eye of stone that never closes. There will still be a window that needs no knock. There will still be a small round tower, like the cochlea of humankind, still trying to hear the very first heartbeat of the sky.